All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. I see that we've already got hopping on some of our students, some alumni, and then members of our professional chapters. So thank you all for joining us for this lunchtime talk here on Thursday for Richard Vague's newest book. So to just quickly introduce myself, for those of you who have not met me yet, I'm Mike Watson. I'm the newest executive director of the Alexander Hamilton Society. So I've been here for about 2 months, and as many of you guys already know, we have about 2,500 alumni around the country. We do events on 80 or so college campuses. We've got professional chapters in Washington and New York. So, for those of you who are already members of our society, thanks for all the good work you're doing. For those of you who are tuning in and maybe don't know about us, I highly encourage you to check out our website, alexanderhamiltonsociety.org, where you can find out about further ways you can be plugged in. So, thanks for joining us. Now on to the real business at hand today, which is we're going to be talking with Richard Vague about his newest book. But to give you some background about Richard, he's a businessman, a banker. He's been commenting on economics for a long time at a very high level. He's the former Secretary of Banking and Securities for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And two of his earlier books that really made waves are The Case for a Debt Jubilee and The Paradox of Debt. But today we're going to talk about his newest book, The Banker Who Made America, Thomas Willing, and the Rise of the American Financial Aristocracy from 1731 to 1821. So, Richard, thank you for joining us.
It's such a privilege to be here. Thanks to you and thanks to Roy Katsovitz who introduced me to the society. I feel like it's a real privilege to be here.
Yeah, great. Well, we feel the same way. And, as we just talked about a moment ago, the subtitle of your book had already embedded a surprise for me. When I saw the title, "The Banker Who Made America," I thought, okay, another Robert Morris biography. Robert Morris is the financier of the Revolution, and so then, the next two words, I thought, well, hold on, who is this Thomas Willing guy? Having read the book, which is very good, I now know the answer. But for those of our audience members who have not yet taken a look at it, this book is now on sale, by the way, wherever books are sold. Who is Thomas Willing?
Thomas Wilting was the head of the largest merchant trading firm in the colonies in the lead up to the Revolution. He hired a young man named Robert Morris and eventually elevated him to partner, and the two of them ran a firm called Willing Morris and Company, which was extremely powerful and significant in colonial times. And the two of them started a bank in the middle of the Revolution to help finance the Revolution as Morris was assuming his superintendent of finance duties.
Yeah. One of the things I really like about your book is that you point out that, there are the bigger picture debates about ideas of kind of like what people are like, how they should rule themselves and all that. But to really understand how events unfold, you also have to kind of follow the money and understand where it goes. If you step back to kind of before we even reach independence, you point out there's actually a really big money problem, both in the British Empire and then in the American colonies. And that's part of what ends up driving a lot of Americans to rethink their relationship with the home country. So, can you walk us through a bit of what's going on before we even get to, the really dramatic stuff that leads us to think about separating from the British Empire?
Well, thank you. The country's undergoing an unprecedented boom, with the country being the colonies together.
Mhm.
They go from, essentially no GDP to a GDP that is a third of mighty Britain's by the end of the century. They go from 200,000 folks to 5 million folks. I think it's the greatest boom in world history financially, but they
Mhm.
keep bumping up against this problem of not enough money. And that's exacerbated by their treatment by Britain, which imposes trying to pay back for their French and Indian War expenditures. They impose, Sugar Act, Currency Act, Stamp Act, Townsend Acts. And so it creates an enormous conflict between these, increasingly powerful colonials and the mothership.
Yeah. And for Willing itself, it seemed to me like some of these actions were a bit more harmful than others. So, as you point out, like, you do need money in order to facilitate the exchange of goods and services. And if I recall correctly, like right off the bat, the British Empire kind of tries to clamp down on the flow of money, on the other side of the Atlantic from them, which is us.
Yeah, there's a lot of folks issuing currency to kind of make up for this shortfall. Takes money to grow. They didn't have enough money. Their gold and silver was going in their net deficit to the mother ship that they were losing all their gold and silver. So states issued currency, some private individuals issued currency. It was a chaos. And in the middle of it all, in 1860 or 1763, Britain comes down and actually enacts the Currency Act, which prohibits the colonies from issuing currency. So their
Mhm.
one little lifeline to economic growth gets shut down, and it creates, a depression in the middle of the 1760s that they have to respond to.
Yeah. And so, for a lot of people, you can kind of start seeing why they started thinking, hold on, this is not the best solution. So Willing is skeptical of a lot of what the government is doing, but he ends up not carrying his case against the British Empire as far as other colonists do, even, before the shooting starts. Is that right?
Yeah, I think there's really three, as the idea of independence emerges, you have really three camps. You
Mhm.
have the radical group that really want independence, and a lot of those folks are the renegade Scotch-Irish Presbyterians that are pouring into Pennsylvania and elsewhere. And you have the loyalists that, really, have an undying commitment to Britain. But there's a whole lot of folks in the middle that wish the whole thing would blow over.
Yeah.
And Willing is one of those folks. Willing and Morris are both one of those folks in that camp. They're making money hand over fist.
Mhm.
In his lifetime, Willing increases the size of his firm by 70 times. He goes from 3 ships to dozens of ships, and his importance just escalates.
Mhm.
So he doesn't want to ruin a good thing. And most of the merchant community is in that same camp. They're doing so well, they really don't want to upset the apple cart. And when the moment of truth comes, as the book gets into in great detail, they actually vote against the Declaration of Independence for that very reason. They're not
Mhm.
loyalists, but they don't want to pull themselves completely away from Britain.
Yeah, and if I recall correctly, was it Morris and Willing both arrive, or well, I guess they'd already been there, but they both are at the Continental Congress in July of 1776, and they both end up voting initially against it. But then there's some shenanigans, and maybe not shenanigans, some parliamentary maneuvering, we'll call it that. And then the votes start changing, but Willing stays pretty consistent.
Yeah, on July 1st, John Dickinson and Charles Humphreys, vote against the Declaration of Independence. So Pennsylvania's vote is 4-3 against.
Mhm.
And a big part of the reason is that the Assembly, Pennsylvania's state government, has actually prohibited them from voting against independence. That's how firmly entrenched in Pennsylvania this anti-independence sentiment is. So it's a dramatic moment. And Ben Franklin, by the way, is one of the guys that kind of turns that around. But in the background, these same renegade Scotch-Irish Presbyterians have really enacted what I call a coup d'etat of
Mhm.
Pennsylvania's government that really begins in the spring of 74 and concludes in June of 76, in which they completely dismantle Pennsylvania's government in large part through these parliamentary procedures and techniques that you alluded to, so that by the time July comes around, there is no state government in Pennsylvania. And, Willing and others are kind of, without, they're kind of unmoored or unanchored.
Yeah. Where I'm from in Virginia, both where I live now and then also where I grew up, also a Commonwealth like Pennsylvania. And, for them, the revolutionaries, the solution was a little bit more clear cut, right? You basically say there's a royal governor and we're going to chase him onto a British warship and then he's going to leave. And, then we can kind of start, changing the House of Burgesses a little bit. We'll have a governor instead of that's elected or selected by the legislature rather than a royal governor. But Pennsylvania was actually a bit different than all the other colonies, if I recall correctly.
Pennsylvania had a lot of reasons to ingratiate itself to Britain. The Penn family wanted to preserve their tax advantage. The wealthy Quaker and Anglican merchants that were in the assembly wanted to end Penn's tax advantage. So both groups are trying to curry favor with king and parliament. So they're not really set up to protest too vigorously against that. There's
Mhm.
another really important fact, though, and that is Philadelphia's merchants are creditors,
Mhm.
and Virginia's planters are debtors.
Right.
And this is Jefferson and all these other tobacco growers, and they're largely in debt to Scottish lenders.
Hmm.
And there's this massive financial crisis in 1772 that causes these Scottish lenders to call the loans of a lot of the Virginia and Maryland planters. So it creates really a profound crisis in the United States that puts Virginians in the mind of really, shall we call it, despising their British creditors. And Pennsylvanians aren't in that same camp. So there's this fundamental difference between Pennsylvania and Virginia on that very important count.
Mhm. Yeah, and given not just Pennsylvania's size, but also that it's the kind of the hinge just geographically between the New England firebrands, let's say, and then the Southerners who are more interested in independence. Not everyone in the South is by any means. They really need to bring Pennsylvania alongside if there's going to be any hope of maintaining independence.
Yeah, that July 1st vote, nine of the states vote for independence, but they all really realize that it has to be unanimous or they
Mhm.
don't really have a chance. And for the very reason you suggested, Pennsylvania's this huge plot of land right in the middle of the colonies. And if they don't agree to independence, Britain will just camp out there and prevent, the coalescing of the other colonies.
Mhm. Yeah, and so as you talk about a little bit, there's about it's 4-3 opposed to independence, and then it's 4-3, and then it ends up, or do I have this wrong? Was
You
it
have it right.
right? Okay, and then it ends up being 3-2 in favor.
So the July 1st vote is a committee of the whole vote, which is the artifice they use to kind of have a practice vote on things.
Hmm.
And it's 4-3 against. Ben Franklin is best we can tell, Ben Franklin talks Willing and Dickinson not into voting yes. They're not prepared to do that, but they do agree to not show up the next day.
Okay.
And so there's only 5 delegates left. And it's only Humphreys and Willing that are still voting no, and the other three are still voting yes, including Franklin. So Pennsylvania's no becomes a yes on July 2nd, which is the official date of approving independence.
So I think one of the points making in the book is that we'll talk about like Willing goes on to have a really distinguished career, not just in business but also in service to this country. But Morris, who just doesn't show up, gets a lot of credit for some things that maybe Willing had more to do with. And you think it may have something to do with the changes that occur between July 1st and 2nd.
Yeah, once, Willing has been mayor, Supreme Court justice, assemblyman. He's really the leader of Philadelphia's business and merchant community. He's the signatory on the Stamp Act. That's a group of 400 merchants, of which he's the leading merchant.
Hmm.
So, his provenance is impeccable until he votes against the Declaration of Independence. And that really effectively ends his political career, even though from that point forward, he serves the country magnificently as a financier alongside his business partner, Robert Morris. But his life changes because he didn't vote the correct way on July 2nd.
No. No. Well, then, the plot thickens a little bit, right? Because he's in Philadelphia, which the Brits get removed from Boston, take New York, and then they end up back in Philadelphia, kind of a circuitous route a couple of years later. And for the business community, this is another kind of difficult time to figure out exactly what they should be doing because it kind of looks like the revolution's over at this point.
it's an awkward time because General Howe and the Brits take over Philadelphia. And as you just pointed out, the Continental Congress moves out to York,
Mhm.
but Willing doesn't. He stays there to preserve his business.
Mhm.
And that's kind of like a second strike against him because, the radical Scotch Irish Presbyterians that are so gung ho for independence, um, view him askance because he stays there. And then he does a third thing, and I really the last thing before he falls fully in line. Howe goes to him and says, I'll make you a deal. I'll make America a deal. I'll give you everything you were asking for in 1763. I'll give you representation. I'll let you decide your own taxes. I'll repeal currency, intolerable Townsend, all these acts. If we can just call this off and y'all come back into the fold.
Mhm.
Willing think that's a reasonable thing for the Congress to consider. The Congress doesn't consider it a reasonable thing at that. They're too far gone. And so Willing sends one of his employees out to York to bring the offer, and the Congress immediately jails him. And
Yeah.
that's also viewed as Willing having done something that was really not in keeping with what everybody else was feeling. But
Mhm.
after that, he gets on board in a very vigorous way and helps, finance the whole thing, becomes the nation's first banker and first central banker.
Yeah. And around so it's after that that he really starts intersecting with Alexander Hamilton, who is a longtime staffer for George Washington, functions kind of like his chief of staff, ends up deciding that it's time to go do something else for a little bit. And of all of the things that are going on in the war, Hamilton starts thinking about finance, not just in terms of we need to be able to pay for our army to move around and fight and so on and so forth. But he's already thinking through, like, if we end up winning, even though things don't look so good, at 1780 or so, when he leaves Washington's staff, he's already thinking through, well, if we win, we're going to need certain kinds of institutions in order for our country to thrive. And at this point, the kind of Hamilton Morris Willing connection starts to really thrive, right?
Yeah, interestingly, Hamilton first interacts with Willing in way back before the war when Hamilton is 16 years old and in St. Croix and
Mhm.
effectively running his boss's firm at that a trading firm there. Willing is 41 years old and already the colony's leading merchant trader, and they're trading wheat flour. So they knew each other from the time that Alexander Hamilton is very young. And I think Hamilton comes up, looking up to these guys. And when they charter the bank in 1781, the continental currency has become useless. There's no other place to go for money except European lenders who are increasingly reluctant. So they charter a bank and ends up being very successful. And Hamilton is right there and rejoices. He's figured it out. You know how Hamilton is. He's written this, I think, 15,000 word analysis, and he's figured out how much it's costing Britain, which is about 3.5 times as much as it costs the US. He's figured out how Britain's going to fund that. He's figured out our shortfall in funding our war. And he and Washington and others have really figured out at this point in time that America doesn't have to win the war. All it has to do is not lose. And Hamilton's convinced that if we have a bank, we can fund the next few years and it makes our independence assured. So he's a huge fan of what Willing and Morris are doing. And they obviously stay very, very close over the next decade and more. And in fact, they end up being across the street neighbors. And I guess we'll get into this because, Hamilton becomes Secretary of the Treasury at the same time that Willing is head
Mhm.
of the central bank, and they work together every day to make sure that mechanism works.
Mhm. Yeah, and there's a kind of a side detour that many people know about the Battle of Yorktown. Hamilton's moment of glory, and the revolution is taking Redoubt 10, leads to the Brits surrendering here. But before we even get there, it's the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and some of the business community there that end up actually making even that part of the campaign possible.
Absolutely. They, in 1780 and 81, when we're out of funds, a group that Madison calls the opulent merchants of Philadelphia, which is, of
Yeah.
course, Willing and Morris and others, really saved the day by pooling their money into
Mhm.
something they call a bank, but it's really just a repository for funds to help fund Yorktown and the Southern campaign and really the back half of the war.
Mhm.
Um, but that idea quickly morphs into an actual bank, the Bank of North America, which is chartered in 1781 and becomes the nation's very first bank. And Willing is the president.
Yeah. And as I understand it, at this point, his business partner Morris is now running the committee or the department in the Continental Congress that's in charge of finance. So he can't, you know, both be in charge of the government that's borrowing money from the bank and in charge of the bank. Might Some might suggest that would be a conflict of interest. So Willing, his business partner, ends up starting to run the bank, and there's like a power imbalance that shifts over the year and a half or so between Yorktown and the actual end of the war, right? Where the Continental Congress kind of gets its act together in terms of finances, but Willing actually ends up preventing them from ending up with an even bigger debt problem.
Willing is very conservative and has a backbone of steel. But as I said earlier, they've kind of figured out that all they have to do is not lose. And when we've got this on our website, thomaswilling.com, but we've mapped out the expenses year by year of the revolution. In the early years, they're spending $20 million a year. That's
Mhm.
specie equivalent. So I've taken currency and translated that into its specie equivalent. They're
Mhm.
spending like 20, $21 million a year early in the war. By the time you get to 1780, 81 and beyond, they've reduced that to 8 million and
Mhm.
then down to 3 million. So
Mhm.
they're running this war on the cheap.
Yeah.
And Willing is one of the guys who has the attitude that, we need to make sure and pay attention to the purse. And Morris comes to him for a loan and he turns Morris down. So, and he actually does that again later when he's at the Bank of the United States, but he's conservative down to his toenails.
Mhm. Yeah, and you can kind of see how this would create a bit of a tension between, if you think about the people in the Continental Army who are not necessarily always getting paid at all, let alone on time, and they're seeing the material shortages that occur, and then they're also seeing this like kind of this is kind of weird that we're out there fighting, but it doesn't seem like the back end is really taking care of them. It ends up creating a lot of tensions towards the end of the war.
Absolutely. It's the paradox you suggest. The army really is poorly paid and poorly treated during the entire revolution. We see that again and again. They're in Valley Forge starving. They're having parties in Philadelphia.
Mhm.
And there's plenty of food and there's plenty of wheat and there's plenty of everything. There's just not the will to pay for it.
Mhm.
So yeah, there's a real dichotomy. And in fact, in 1783, when there's the famous, near mutiny, some of the mutineers come to Philadelphia on the back end of that and seriously consider going into the bank and just taking the silver and gold from the bank to pay the soldiers. They don't, but they come very, very close and it has to be guarded for a period of time.
Yeah. So this is all kind of leading up to, as this war ends, Hamilton realizes that, and Hamilton, a lot of the business community realizes that we've got a huge debt problem, and there actually is a way to turn this into a debt opportunity, kind of. And part of that involves creating the first bank of the United States, um, uh, which, if you happen to not be looking at, or if you happen to not be looking at the video while you're listening to our conversation, we've got a painting of it up here in my office here at the Hamilton Society. But you know, Hamilton and Willing and all that start to kind of put their heads together to figure out what can we actually do to not just avoid bankruptcy, but figure out how to use this debt as a mechanism for not just unifying the country, but also for making it stronger over time.
It's very interesting and a really important moment in American history because there's about $72 million in debt in a country that has a GDP of that time, let's call it roughly 250 million.
Hmm.
So it's really a very affordable and serviceable debt the way we think about it now. But the Continental Congress does not have the power to tax. And it becomes the single biggest political issue in the country. And you have a lot of folks that bought bonds early in the war out of patriotism. You have a lot of folks that sold supplies and took scrip in exchange, but they're not getting repaid on that, and they're not getting paid interest on it. So the face value of that 72 million is dropped to 10 or 20 cents on the dollar. Some of these folks, it's their only liquid net worth. And so folks have gone into penury simply because the Continental Congress can't get the votes to enact tax. And in my opinion, and this is the big fight in the middle of the 80s, and you see Hamilton writes on the subject. Morris writes, I think, a 16,000 word treatise that he sends to the Continental Congress arguing one thing: why the country should start paying interest on the debt. Hamilton comes in and tells him it's a perfect paper, and he agrees completely, but they don't do it. And ultimately, the resolution is to call a constitutional convention in 87 and create a mechanism for enacting tax without the yes vote of all 13 colonies. And I actually argue in the book, and we get into the math in some detail, that this is perhaps even the single most important reason that the Constitutional Convention was called. And, there's a lot of debate and a lot of argument about that, but just think about it. The Continental Congress, or as it was called, the Confederation Congress, was kind of a weak league of states. It wasn't really a government with much power at all. All the power still resided in the states. The glamour jobs at that time are to be governor of Pennsylvania or governor of Virginia or governor of Massachusetts. And why would we ever give up that prerogative and that power to create a single country? Well, it's because so many of the leading powerful, wealthy folks wanted to get fully repaid at 100 cents on the dollar for their debt. And notice that once the Constitution's enacted, the first two things that had the very first thing that happens of any consequence, besides a few little administrative thing, is they enact a tax. Okay. And then they put Hamilton on the clock. And I think give him like 120 days to come up with a plan for redeeming all that $70 million in debt. Those are the first two things the government does, which I think underscores this reality that the reason we came together as a single country was to take care of that debt. And Hamilton advances all his, now famous ideas for why that's the case. And he proves largely correct. I mean, he's clearly a giant of finance, but that's what's going on.
Yeah. And part of that is building out this bank, which, I'm kind of an amateur enthusiast about this period. And I had kind of thought, when people talk about, dollars or whatnot, that I just assumed that there was some kind of sense of, everybody, like today, like everyone uses the same dollar. But that's not really how things work at this period, right? You've got all kinds of, not just like you got your British stamped coin and your Spanish stamped coin, but some of the states have their own currencies. You know, individual banks in these states have their own currency. Sometimes other companies are issuing IOUs that are effectively used as money. So it's kind of a chaotic environment if you wanted to, I don't know, ship some of your cotton from like South Carolina up to New York. It actually takes a lot of like math in your head just to figure out, how to do this stuff.
It is absolutely chaos, and they do enact a bank. That's the third thing they do is enact the bank. And to these guys, government debt and a bank were symbiotic.
Mhm.
They went hand in glove, and their model is the 1694 chartering of the Bank of England itself, which of course was put together to help finance William of William and Mary fame's wars against France. And
Mhm.
it succeeds, and it revolutionizes England, and all these folks, including Hamilton and Willing, idolize the financial system in Britain. And so they, in essence, want to recreate it. So to them, having government debt means you have to have a bank because the bank can do several things. It can buy that debt, it, in essence, be a market maker for that debt. It can lend, cash flow loans or working capital loans to the government. The two things go together, but the side benefit is that the form that the loans take is currency. So to get a loan from the Bank of the United States means you took, if you got $1,000 loan, you took away $1,000 of Bank of the United States currency, and you could pay merchants, and it became the revolutionary new thing. But it wasn't an official government currency; it was the bank's currency, and the bank was privately owned. But it takes a first important step to displacing this cacophony of currencies that are making everyone's life so difficult in the colonies and now the United States.
Yeah. And so as you alluded to, there's two parts to this. One is just the ease of doing business benefits of it. And the other part of it is, the British Empire did okay after they founded the Bank of England. One could argue that they, became a lot more significant. They're able to defeat their biggest adversary, France. It takes them over 100 years, but they're able to pull it off. And so there's not just the like you want your economy to function, but also if you there's a sense, it seems like, from the founding fathers of if you want to be able to stand on your own 2 feet, be able to resist further problems that could come up from the other European empires, many of whom were, our country's neighbors at the time, you really do need a sound financial system in order to be a great power, or at the very least prevent other people from biting parts of your territory.
I think you're hitting the nail on the head. And Washington himself is a huge admirer of the Bank of England, and he has the famous quote, whoever has the longest purse chiefly determines the event. If you got
Yeah.
money, you can win. If you don't have money, you can't.
Yeah.
And so they're all huge fans. I personally view 1694 and the Bank of England as the bright line that begins the modern age.
Mhm.
And so they have this admiration, but they create something that quickly becomes, in my view, as powerful as the system that was created in England.
Yeah. One of the interesting side plots that I had not fully processed until reading your book is about Barings Bank, which, we all know about, well, those of us who've like, done the like, IR classes and all that probably know a bit about the Bank of England. But Barings Bank also becomes kind of Goliath of this period. There's a British newspaper that says basically there's like six great powers in the world. It's like England, France, Russia, a couple other ones, and then Barings Bank. And so, Willing ends up not just, being the president of this bank that is so important for the United States, but it ends up having this really interesting business connection with one of the most important, like private institutions in the world at this period.
Yeah, they're the two biggest powers on the both sides of the Atlantic. The Baring brothers on one side and Willing on the other. They start doing business right before the Revolutionary War, and they
Mhm.
begin doing an enormous amount of business afterwards. And lo and behold, the heir, the scion of the Baring family, Alexander, young 20-year-old Alexander, comes to the United States for a land transaction, which is kind of its own story, falls in love with Willing's granddaughter, Anne Louisa, and gets married. So
Mhm.
Willing not only has a business affiliation, he is related to them. And Baring, for a period of time, about 5 years, lives two doors down from Willing on 3rd Street in Philly. So for those of you who know Philly, all this is happening between Spruce and Chestnut on 3rd Street. It's the most important two-block stretch in the nation.
Mhm.
And Thomas Willing, the most important banker in the United States, and Alexander Baring, the most important banker in Europe, lived two doors away from each other for an extended period of time. And by the way, there's not even a marker
Oh,
to
really?
note that.
That is wild. Yeah. Uh, so it turns out that this relationship, not just seems like both sides do pretty well, off of that. As you point out, Willing's, his empire, his business empire just explodes after the war. Bering also does pretty darn well. But it ends up actually being really good for Americans that they happen to, be that close because there's like a strategic problem that comes up for us when Napoleon gets control of the Louisiana Territory.
Yeah, the United States doesn't have $15 million
Mm.
to buy the Louisiana Purchase, so the Louisiana Territory. And it gets financed through the Bering family, largely. But Willing plays a big part in it too. So the Barings and the Willings are the ones that finance the Louisiana Purchase. But, the Bering family, because Napoleon is taking so much is enacting war and creating so much chaos in Europe, folks like the Barings are moving money to America and they're trying to develop business in America. And it becomes something that's very important to the United States for reasons such as financing the payoff to the Barbary pirates, which the
Yeah.
Barings and the Willings are also involved in, and any number of other transactions. So it's one of the most important relationships that there for the nascent and growing United States. It brings the financial resources that make so much of what they need to do possible.
Yeah. So, I can see how somebody would sit back and say, well, this is a little bit of a strange setup, right? Where, you've got these American merchants who, while we're at war with the UK, are trading with British merchants, and then wait, hold on, Barings, they're British subjects or English subjects, but they're financing a loan for the French government, which is at war with the UK. And so, it's like there's actually, even though the system overall, despite some of the kind of strange convolutions, and it ends up being really good for us, there's actually a lot of pushback at the time.
It's one of the strangest things that you can imagine. Napoleon has been at war with Britain. They have this brief caesura, this brief window when they're at peace. They go right back to war in 1804. But 1803 happens to be the year the Louisiana Territory Purchase happens, and they seek permission from their government to finance it because the proceeds of the sale are going to go to Napoleon.
Yeah.
And they're going to be the financiers. They're the one that turn the bonds into gold and ship the gold to Napoleon. And they kind of get permission from the government, kind of not. The government tries to withdraw that permission. They kind of ignore it. And to me, it shows the relative power of finance to governments
Mhm.
and very much in the favor of finance. The Barings kind of do what they want to do and send $15 million to Napoleon on the brink of his renewed war with Britain. It's frankly quite amazing. There's two postscripts to that I like to point out. One of them is Napoleon's extracting money from a lot of sources. He gets, 30 million from Spain, et cetera, et cetera. He uses that 15 million from the Louisiana Purchase to finance his coronation at Notre Dame. Amazing.
Yeah.
And the other postscript is the states that are formed from the Louisiana Territory all become slave states. And so
Yeah.
that in that purchase are the seeds of the American Civil War. So three interesting things about the Louisiana Purchase.
Yeah. You know, it seems like this is all working out super well, right? And that so the first bank in the United States, basically solves our credit problems. As you pointed out, like it ends up giving a lot of businesses opportunities to make easier transactions than otherwise. Willing does a really good job, not just in terms of developing his own business, but also he's a really good steward of those funds. As far as I can tell, nobody really thinks that there's any kind of malfeasance going on there. Hamilton gets investigated by Jefferson's party when they control Congress, and basically comes back and says, "Well, I can't find anything." But we end up having a second Bank of the United States later because the first one, the charter expires. So there's like this anti-banking backlash that occurs that doesn't quite make sense to me.
Well, the bank is a federalist institution, and Jefferson and the Anti-Federalists are against it. And I think there's good reason
Mhm.
because during very pivotal moments early in the nation's history, especially the fight for the ratification of the Constitution itself,
Mhm.
folks, and by the way, remember, Willing was at the Bank of North America and then goes to the Bank of the United States. So he's the nation's principal lender before the Bank of the United States is enacted, folks feared Willing.
Hmm.
And they feared that if they didn't vote the way Willing wanted them to vote, that they would be declined a loan at his bank. And
Hmm.
he's by far the dominant. There aren't 100 banks to choose from. There's a handful. And so that's, I think, the fear that Jefferson and others have about textbooks don't say this, but I think it's a lot clearer and a lot simpler than things. So if you're a bank, you can use money to influence votes. And he does.
Hmm.
And whether it's true or not, because I don't think Willing is that blatant about things. I think he's ultimately gracious about everything he does. But folks know they need to be on his good side. So a lot of folks vote for the Constitution because of Willing. A lot of folks vote for the Jay Treaty because Willing is for it. So, the anti-federalists or the Republicans have every good reason to resent the first bank. It's a political weapon. And,
Hmm.
they go so far as to say, John Adams actually says, a banking aristocracy is no better than the aristocracy we just defeated in Britain. And he views Willing and those guys as being like the first aristocracy in the United States, and he resents them. So by the time 1811 comes around and the 20-year charter of the Bank of the United States expires, there's enough folks who resent it that it doesn't get renewed.
Well, I got one last question, and then I'm gonna start going through the one. As we're talking, I'm going through the questions that we're getting from the audience. So I'll pitch over to audience questions in a moment. But Willing has some health issues towards the end of his life, and so his spot in the public discussion starts to kind of decrease as he's just not able to do as much. But he kind of ends up with the last laugh, right? The Jeffersonians, like you're saying, like, they don't like this idea of a banking aristocracy. Then suddenly, when their party is in charge and they end up in a war with Great Britain again, the War of 1812, they kind of think, oh, it turns out that it is in fact very, very useful when you're in a war to be able to, borrow money to basically, afford all the stuff you need to fight back. So the second bank, as you said, comes back.
Yeah, they get rid of the bank just before the War of 1812. And they're left in the embarrassing position of having to go to John Jacob Astor and others to help finance the early years of the War of 1812. And in fact, they end up defaulting on U.S. debt during that war for the first time, and I think the only time in U.S. history. So, they scramble and they get another bank and put it into place in 1816. So it is a vindication of Willing. But Willing was an Iron Man. He was the nation's principal merchant for 30 years, and then he's the nation's principal banker for 27 years. He makes what I estimate to be half of all the loans made in the country. So he's an Iron Man. But in 1807, at a very advanced age, he has a stroke, and he decides it's time to step back a little bit, and he effectively does. Even though he lives another 14 years, he steps back from the bank at that point.
Yeah. So, some of the questions we've got coming in are one is, you talked a little bit about the Scots Irish, and I don't think you use the term populism, but there's, the sense of there's kind of the people, and then there's the elites, which has a bit of a resonance with how you think about our politics today, right? So, not saying that it's exactly the same thing. We're not exactly arguing over like whether we should be independent from Great Britain or not. But do you see some kind of similarities when you watch, like, when you're doing your research for your book? Is this kind of similar to the sorts of things you were seeing when you're like opening up the newspaper?
I do. I think it's a profound similarity. I think at that time, what's very clear in 1776 is you have two fully developed camps. You have the Philadelphia merchant elite, and this is within Pennsylvania, and to a lesser extent in other states, but mainly in Pennsylvania. You have the coastal elites versus the middle class on the interior.
Hmm.
And it is a profound difference, and it is a vitriolic contest between those two. And we see that recur again and again in American history, and I think we're seeing it again. There's really a lot that is not new about what we're experiencing today. I think, deeply embedded into what America has always been.
Mhm. And as you point out, back in the day, you can see the argument on the other side, right? Oftentimes this is just my thought, but oftentimes we have Americans who kind of are like fighting each other like cats and dogs, and usually it's because they both kind of are seeing the same problem from different sides, and the tension between the two ends up actually kind of being healthy over the long term. So.
I think you're exactly right. I think the greatness of America is that, and Willing is a big part of this. At the end of the day, he's a fundamentally agreeable man.
Mhm.
He has, deeply embedded convictions, but he and others, at moments when they didn't want to, and it was very begrudging and very reluctant, nevertheless came to compromises that resulted in the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and so much else that has created the greatest democracy in the world. And I think that's one of the key lessons of Thomas Willing is, that they did have very different views and there were valid points on both sides and there was vitriol everywhere. And
Mhm.
yet, when it counted, they came together.
Yeah. Yeah. Another question we've got is Pennsylvania has a lot of Quakers, right, at this period. And one question was more or less, so Willing is concerned about the Declaration, and does that have anything to do with him being a Quaker and trying to figure out how to avoid an armed conflict, or is it, the other stuff that you talked about?
Well, he's an Anglican.
Mhm. Ah.
And the Quakers, and there's a split between, the two elite camps of the Quakers and the Anglicans.
Mhm.
And the Quakers have become discredited by the time you get to the moment of truth at the Declaration of Independence. And the reason they have become discredited is this flood of Scotch Irish Presbyterians have gone to the western part of the state, and the state government will not spend the money to protect them.
Mhm.
And that gets to be a bigger and bigger problem. And one of the places it plays out is at the ballot box. Because as these Scotch Irish Presbyterians become a bigger part of the population, they vote against the Quakers that won't take care of them.
Mhm.
And so, I'm not going to say Quakers are gone by the time 1776 comes along, but it's really the Anglicans that have emerged, and they don't have that fundamental religious opposition to war. Thomas Willing made a lot of money on the French and Indian War. War's a fact of life for these guys. But the Quakers have become a secondary factor by the time all this emerges.
One of the comments I got, Mike, you skipped over a huge chunk of his life if he was born in 1731. So what was he doing before independence?
His dad dies when he's 23. When he's a little 9-year old, his
Mhm.
his father Charles sends him to England for education. So he gets, both the elementary school and high school equivalent, and what little college and law degree that he has in
Mhm.
London. And he comes back and he gets settled in. And by the way, his dad has hired this young 15-year-old named Robert Morris, and so they become fast friends. And then unexpectedly, his dad dies when he's 23.
Mhm.
And so he becomes, two big things happen at that moment. One is that he inherits this huge firm that he's now the proprietor of. The second thing is he's got 9 brothers and sisters, and he becomes the surrogate father for those. So this
Yeah.
23-year-old has these grim responsibilities right out of the box. And there's two things he's confronted with almost immediately. One of those is what to do about the firm, and almost immediately, this 23-year-old goes out and buys another ship. He expands the firm within months of his dad's death,
Mhm.
which I think speaks to his character. I mean, he's this amalgam of conservatism and boldness that I think's fairly unique. The other thing that he sees is that his dad has not been a careful steward of his will for all his brothers and sisters. He hadn't even included the youngest ones. And he
Mhm.
immediately goes into a panic. He corresponds to his overseas relatives, says, "I wish you were here to counsel me." but he can already see there's going to be litigation on the will over the course of his life, and that his dad has been a sloppy record keeper. And one of the things that characterizes his life is he's a fastidious record
Hmm.
keeper, and I think that may be part of the reason is he's seen the damage that it can do.
Makes sense. And so, as you point out, there's this like transatlantic, elite, so to speak, that's kind of bouncing back and forth between the UK and the US. In some ways, that's very similar to late 1800s, early 1900s, where you start having like Winston Churchill's mom is an American. You start having more Americans going back across the pond for extended stays. Sometimes they get married while they're there. Sometimes they get married, sometimes they're going over there to get married, right? So it's kind of interesting seeing this kind of come not full circle, but come a lot of the way back by 150 years after the revolution.
It's unbelievable. I'll tell you a couple of anecdotes about that. The guys on the British side that are negotiating the peace treaty that ends the Revolutionary War
Mhm.
have economic interests in America,
Hmm.
including land and slave holdings.
Hmm.
So you talk about conflict of interest, and a lot of historians characterize that peace treaty as one of the best anyone ever got at the end of the war. We got all the land to the Mississippi as one outcome. That
Yeah.
was not a given.
Mhm.
So, the other thing that I'll tell you is that uh, because of his Bering connections, they're very connected to the Marquis Lansdowne, who's very close to the prime minister. And at that crucial moment of 1783, they're in the prime minister's office representing the interests of the merchant traders in saying this war is bad for us. We
Hmm.
need to end it. So that's another, conflict of interest that happens, but they're replete with those. There's marriages, there's and famously, including Willing's family, they intermarry to preserve wealth and preserve political power. There is an aristocracy there at that
Hmm.
moment in history. We like to think of this country as without classes. Well, that's never really true.
One of the questions we had afterwards actually is, if you think about the Adams family, right? So there's John Adams, then John Quincy Adams, and there's a bunch of other ones. The question was like, kind of what happens to the Willings family after this?
Well, we actually found a couple of currently living descendants,
Hmm.
but his son, I hate to say, Thomas Main Willing is a little bit of a ne'er-do-well, and so
Hmm.
the firm that comes after Willing is called Willing and Francis.
Hmm.
And they're never as bold as successful as the father, and it kind of peters out over the next couple of generations. But
Hmm.
they had a lot of wealth. So you go out into the furniture or silver collection industry, and you'll find a lot of Willing family artifacts.
Hmm. Gotcha. So they probably would have, so Thomas Willing's sons probably were on the downslope before JP Morgan's dad, Junius, would have really become another key node in that Anglo-American connection.
Well, that's exactly right. But the next big dominant merchant on the scene is Stephen Girard.
Hmm.
And when the Bank of the United States loses its charter in 1811, who is there to buy it out of, it's not bankruptcy, but it's defunctness? And
Yeah.
that's Stephen Girard. He buys the asset. He doesn't buy the entity, he buys the assets,
Hmm.
stays in the same building, lets the Bank of the United States executives wind down the operation in a little corner office inside the bank and starts what he calls Stephen Girard's Bank. And, he becomes the wealthiest man in America, and he helps finance the American Revolution along with John Jacob Astor, who we just mentioned. So the next generation of power is Willing first, and then Girard.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Well, that's really interesting. So, let me see. In terms of other questions we've got, um, who do you think today is most like Thomas Willing?
You know, I've been asked this question, and I'm not sure I have a good answer. We have a lot of powerful bankers, and we
Hmm.
have a lot of incredible institutions that are bold, and it's not just the banks like Citi and Chase. It's institutions like Apollo and and others that have emerged and are de facto banks, in my view,
Mhm.
that have been very bold. So I think any of those guys. But Willing was very bold and creative. You know, he created a lot of the debt instruments that we think of. He chartered an insurance company. He was always out trying new things. And that's a little bit of the paradox of him. So if you find somebody out there who is truly buttoned down, but also truly aggressive, that's the legacy of Thomas Willing.
Gotcha. You know, I'm curious on your end, when you think about the Jeffersonians at the time, they have concerns about like banks generally, but as you point out, there are not that many banks, right? So you could conceivably end up in a situation where if you tick off the wrong dozen people, your chances of getting a loan are very, very slim to none, right? Whereas now, you're looking at, I mean, we have a very, very large, very deep financial markets and all that. I could see an argument that some of the concerns people had about banking would be more valid back then when it really is a small number of people uh, versus now where, I mean, the credit ratings exist and all that, right? But and reputations do spread, but it's not the same thing today where, if the ABC bank doesn't like your application, well, there's the DEF bank, and GHI is also around too. So possibly there's more disparate power, even though obviously the banking sector is quite large today.
I think you're right. There weren't too many places to go by my back of the napkin calculation because it's hard to get all the information to do this calculation.
Mhm.
Is that Welling made half the loans that were made between 1781 and 1807? That's a lot of power.
Yeah.
And John Adams writes a letter that's very telling. He writes it in 1813. He writes it to Richard Rush, who's Benjamin Rush's son. And comes right out and he says, George Washington and Alexander Hamilton were governed by Thomas Willing.
Mhm.
And it's an astonishing statement because, what we all know is that Adams complained vociferously about the fact that Washington was governed by Hamilton. But here
Yeah.
he's saying something beyond that. He's saying Hamilton and Washington were governed by Willing. And that really speaks to the power of being a lender.
Yeah. That's interesting. You know, there's so many interesting stories about Adams getting so worked up about this concern about hidden forces. That's funny. I had not heard about that one before. That's I mean, until I read your book. That's a really astonishing one
It's
to get.
it's simply astonishing.
Yeah. So, well, I think that that kind of covers all the clusters of questions we've got. So, thank you so much for your time. So, Richard Vague, um, I'm looking at your last book, The Case for Debt Jubilee, which is not the one we're talking about. So, Richard Vague, The
May
Bank.
I hold this up?
There you go. Perfect. Yeah, yeah. Available where books are sold. I've got your review copy, so
Well, you need a prettier copy.
I need to get the
We'll,
hardcover.
we'll make sure you get one.
There you go. What's your next book, by the way?
We went to Willing because we were trying to understand the origins of the American financial system. We didn't expect to find all these stories swirling around. We didn't expect to evolve the Declaration of Independence and things like that. We just thought it'd be a boring monograph about leverage ratios in 1781. But we are trying to get to the heart of the money creation phenomenon itself.
Hmm.
And I view the next step, and I view really the first step in mass money creation in global society, period, being the one we've talked about already today, and that is 1694 and the Bank of England.
Hmm.
And so we're writing a book about the origins of the Bank of England. And by the way, lo and behold, it deeply involves politics. The Bank of England was a Whig institution that was opposed by the Tories. And
Hmm.
that was one of the early big battles in the formation of those two parties within Britain.
There you go. So, if you want to understand how the United States became wealthy and prosperous, you need to check out The Banker Who Made America. And if you want to understand how countries go from being great powers to superpowers, you need to get your next book.
Well, I'm so grateful to you.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much.
Bye bye.